Okay, excellent. Good afternoon and greetings to all. Thank you for accepting our invitation to the first webinar in English titled Open Educational Resources as a Catalyst for Equity and Inclusion with Dr. Arturo Osuna from Tarrant County College Connect Campus. Thank you for your valuable collaboration with HEAD's initiative and that aim to provide special support to member institutions as part of our mission to promote the integration of technology to education. Today, we have more than 200 participants registered from 18 higher education institutions in Puerto Rico, including the Department of Education of Puerto Rico, also 16 higher education institutions in the US and 3 organizations and 1 participant registered from 1 international institution. So greeting to all. We hope that this webinar will be a great benefit to everyone. Before we begin, we would like to emphasize the following. And in the next slide, you will see that in order to benefit from this webinar, please use the chat to share your questions and your comments and feedback. Keep your microphone on mute in every time to avoid interruptions during the recording of this webinar. Also, access the link in the chat to request the certificate of participation, or you can scan the QR code. Stephanie, the QR code, the next slide, please. So you can use your camera and point to scan the code and go directly to the form. Please put your name and make sure your email is correct, because if not, then you will not receive the certificate if the email is not correct. Also, we request that you help us spread the word and invite others to register and participate in our webinars and events. And also at the end of this event, you will receive an email with the link to complete a short electronic webinar or electronic survey to help us evaluate this webinar and help us also identify which head services and initiatives can support your faculty, administrators, and students at your institutions, and how we can best promote these services. The survey is anonymous and it will only take 5 minutes of your time. So your feedback for us is extremely important. So please complete this survey for us. Also, in the next slide, we invite you to invite others to our next event, and you will see the promotional of other events that you will have. For example, the Student Leadership Showcase is the next event we have for next Friday, September 16. The topic is Invierte tu conocimiento, estudia, emprende y triunfa. And we have a panel of 3 very recognized influencers in Puerto Rico, Arnaldo Santiago, Jafet Santiago, and Nicole Chacon. And it will be in a hybrid modality. So please help us invite your students, and also you can join us as well. Faculty and administrators are welcome too. And come here to the theater at Inter-American in Metropolitan Campus. We started at 10 a.m. Until 12 p.m. And if you cannot join us in person, you can also register and select that you will be joining us virtually, and you will receive the link to connect. The next slide shows you the next event that will be a webinar in English as well. And the topic is maximizing your college and university experience. This is scheduled for September 22. And we will start at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And you can go and click on next events in our website, heads.org, to register. The speaker will be Deborah Menier, who is the communications manager at Medical Device Innovation Consortium. And she used to be our student ambassador when she was a student at Inter-American University at Arecibo campus. The next event that we have for this is more for faculty and administrators. It's an online workshop in Spanish, and the expert resource for this workshop is Dr. Ana Milena Lukumi. It will be from September. It will start in September 26th, and you have 1 month to go online at your time. Remember that this is based on your availability, ¿verdad? You can connect, complete all the requirements to complete the workshop, and you will see the members rate and the regular rate. So everybody is welcome. We still have spaces for that workshop. And in the next slide, please save the date. We don't have the exactly dates yet, but we will be having a new section of the Learning Technologies Leadership Academy, and it will be during October or November. Soon we'll be announcing the date, so please save the date, and you can start submitting your application. Remember that this is through applications if you want to participate, so you can reserve the space right away. And the next slide, please, is besides the event, we also want, since you have direct contact with your students, we will like you to help us promote the databases that heads have at the Student Placita. The first one is the Peterson Test Spread, where students and you as well, everybody can use this, can find scholarships, practice tests, and ebooks to prepare for the text, such as the PCAT, the LSAT, GRE, NCAT, that, among others. And in the next slide, you will see that you can follow a very simple step. Just go to the Student Placita in the head website, click on the Peterson Test Spread, and look for the name of your institution. And when you click there, ask you for a password. If you don't have a password, please send us an email to info@head.org, and we will gladly send you the password back so you can enter to the databases. The same process is with the Peterson Career Prep. In this database, users can look for jobs, internships, have very neat templates to create resumes, find a career advice, among other services. And in the next slide, as you may see, the sets are the same and the password is the same. If you don't have the password, send us an email and we will definitely send you back the password so you can enter. This is totally free of charge. And we again invite you to help us promote this among your colleagues and institutions. And also follow us in our social media so you can continue learning about new services, the new dates, and the new information about the event. Now we are ready to start our webinar, and I am pleased to present our guest speaker for today. But before that, since this is the first webinar for faculty and administrators focused on that, we would like to have Dr. Carlos Morales, the head chairman, with a brief welcoming message. Go ahead, Carlos.
Thank you, Yubelkis, Dr. Montalvo. Good afternoon, everybody. Buenas tardes. It is good to see so many attendees this afternoon to join us along with Dr. Osuna on the webinar about open educational resources as a catalyst for equity and inclusion. This is, just so you know, this is part of an initiative that started almost 4 years ago after the membership from HEADS asked the board of directors for options for the membership to learn from other members of HEADS, and certainly in this case, we are leveraging a HEADS member, which is Tarrant County College District, with Dr. Osuna to share his knowledge about OER. So you will learn about how OER helps with equity, as an initiative that is cost savvy, and also providing immediate access to students. I'm happy to report that Arturo Osuna, Dr. Osuna, works with me here at TCC Connect Campus, and I am very happy and grateful for his availability to share his knowledge on this important topic. So again, thank you for being here, and Dr. Montalvo, appreciate the opportunity to address the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Morales, our head chairman, and thank you for inviting Arturo to be part of this initiative. We truly appreciate your support on this, on helping us coordinate this. Now, again, we are ready to present our guest speaker for today, and let me give you a few details of his extensive bio. Dr. Arturo Osuna has extensive experience in higher education, including faculty and staff development, curriculum development, instructional design, technology, and online instruction. He is equity focused and is an advocate for professional growth and lifelong learning. Arturo earned a bachelor's degree of science in information system from the University of Texas in Arlington and a master's degree of business administration from the University of Phoenix and Las Colinas campus. And recently, he earned his Doctor of Education from Southern Methodist University, where his dissertation study explore institutional and intrinsic factors that impact faculty participation in OER development. We will be discussing today. So thank you so much, Dr. Osuna. And please, we will stop sharing our presentation so you can start sharing yours and make your presentations. Remember, at the end, we will be having a Q&A session. So please feel free to look at the chat and write your questions, and either me or Maribel, our executive assistant, will be sharing your questions to Dr. Arturo to make sure that no questions get missed. And also, please make sure that you, in the chat, we will be putting the link so you can request, you can click there and go to the form to request your certificate, and also the links to head events, next events, so you can go and in the meantime, you hear the webinar, attending the webinar, you can register for others if you want to, or put it in your favorites so you can later register for our next event. Go ahead, Dr. Arturo. Thank you so much for your time and willingness to collaborate with us.
Thank you. So yeah, first I just want to thank HETS for this opportunity to talk about a subject that's near and dear to me. And also to Dr. Morales for making me aware of this opportunity, and certainly I'm appreciative of that as well. As they mentioned, just wanted to give a little bit of background. You know, I am sort of leading TCC's efforts, or TCC Connect campus's efforts, to establish an OER textbook development program, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later in the presentation, but it's part of my expertise, and TCC Connect Campus has, fortunately for me, been interested in this work, and so it's something that we'll be doing, and we're going to be proposing ways to increase access, and certainly ways of increasing equity and inclusion, right? So I have been teaching online since around 2008, and my interest in OER started right around 2014. I was looking for resources, and I wanted to look for resources that were free to students, and I came across OER resources for my subject, for the course that I was teaching. And so I adopted OER right around 2014, and that's when I became interested in the subject. As I started my doctoral program, I took the opportunity to sort of immerse myself in the OER world. And so I began learning about OER within the doctoral program itself, and ultimately it culminated into it being the major focus of my study, particularly my study around institutional level OER development. But certainly I learned about adoption and other aspects of OER, but my expertise is specifically in institution level OER development, and that's something obviously that we're doing at TCC Connect campus, or will be doing at TCC Connect campus, and so it's certainly a good fit. I wanted to start by just giving a brief overview of what we're going to be discussing today. Obviously, this introduction, but then I'm also going to talk a little bit about why OER. So why are people utilizing or adopting or developing OER? And then I'll talk a little bit about what is OER. Like, I think there are some misnomers about what it is and what it isn't. And so I'll sort of give you the idea or give you my idea of what OER is, and then sort of a broad definition that encompasses some of what we are going to talk about today, which is, you know, how does OER sort of serve as a vehicle for equity and for inclusion, which is a little sort of less known way that OER can be used. Certainly, equity is up front with you know, with the implications for student costs and things of that nature. And so we'll talk about sort of what we're aiming to do at TCC Connect and proposing to do as part of OER as praxis, right, for inclusion and equity, and then we'll wrap up with any questions. Certainly, if you have questions, you know, feel free to put them in the chat, and if I don't see them, if one of my co-facilitators here will just make me aware of it, I'll do my best to answer.
Yes, that's correct.
But I actually want to start with a question, and I just want to get kind of a sense of the room here, right? So if you just will type in a response for A, B, C, or D here that more fits your interest or level of engagement with OER, right? So you know, type in A if you've developed OER on your own, so, or if you're part of a team who's developed your own OER. B, if you've adopted OER for your courses, some sort of OER. C, if you haven't developed any OER, but maybe you're interested in learning more about what OER is. And then D, if like you don't know what OER is, but you're here and you're willing to learn, right? So if you can just type that into the chat real quick, that way I can get a sense of the room and how comfortable the room is with OER. And okay, some A's, mostly C's, few B's.
Yes, we have people saying C, A. Bueno,
Yeah.
we have the majority say C, but
Yeah.
others say B or A and B.
Okay. Okay. So yeah. So we've got several C's, several
B.
several, yeah, a couple of A's, which is great. If you develop OER, then you're definitely it's definitely awesome. And then some of you have adopted, and that's good. This is great. Okay, excellent. So this gives me a better sense of sort of where you are, and I'm going to provide some context. That way, hopefully, we're all on the same page about OER, and we can move forward. So I want to start with this idea of why people use OER, and I think at the origin. And I'll talk a little bit about the origins of OER, but I think at the base, at the foundation, OER is about the open philosophy, right? It's about this idea that knowledge should be open and readily available and free and accessible. But also beyond that, I think it's also about sort of access, right? Access to education as a basic human right. Right, so this idea that there's knowledge and there are keepers of knowledge, and the open philosophy sort of.
Please, my interruption. Please mute your microphone so you don't interrupt the recording, please. Thank you.
Okay. Yep. All right. So yeah. So it's this idea that the open philosophy, which is that access to education should be a basic human right. And in order to have access to education, you have to have access to knowledge and to the best knowledge. And so I think people participate some people participate in OER, and they do it for this reason. Certainly, this is something that I've been engaged with OER for quite a while now, and it's something that I certainly find near and dear. The idea of open as a basic human right. A lot of people are drawn to OER because of the cost of education in general, right? And the cost of education to students, right? This chart here, this is from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it sort of shows over a 10-year period the cost of education related tuition and fees. And so as you can see there, college textbooks really sort of outpaced other college costs to the point where I think higher education was looking for a solution. And I think part of the growth and popularity of OER has been the proliferation of OER textbooks, right? The form of OER as a textbook. And I think part of what's helped legitimize OER in higher education has been this issue right here, in that textbook costs have just skyrocketed in comparison, while other costs have continued to rise as well, not at the same pace as college textbooks. And so just something to think about around why people use OER and why OER sort of become popular. And this is certainly the case in the US and in Canada. The costs of textbooks have been a real issue.
Arturo, excuse that my interruption, but Eva Caban asked if does sharing papers at ResearchGate count?
If what?
Sharing papers at ResearchGate.
Oh, I see. That's essentially open access, which is a little different. I'm going to define kind of what open what open educational resources are and how they kind of differ from what open access is. And I think there are some distinctions that will sort of clarify, oh, okay, that's open educational resources. And then it's an open access resources is a little bit different. So the other thing I think that's worth noting about sort of the impact that OER has and OER adoption has, there have been several studies that show benefits of OER adoption and development for students, right? So a recent study showed that courses that used OER had lower drop, failures, and withdrawal rates, and students in that study said there was really no difference in the quality of instruction, the quality of the materials in relation to traditional commercial materials, right? Another study showed that actually Pell Grant part-time and historically underserved students scored higher in courses that used OER as opposed to those that use traditional commercial textbooks, traditional textbook model. And so in this case, the impact is showing that for the students who are low socioeconomic background, for students who are part-time, or for students who we typically find that are outperformed, in this case, OER actually help those students specifically do better and score higher in grades. And then another study found that students actually rated OER faculty higher and were more likely to want to take an OER course for all the reasons you can think of, right? Like because they're free of cost, and probably because of some other issues, some other implications that we'll talk about. And while this is a popular reason why people are using OER, it's not the only benefit, and there are other studies that have shown additional benefits for OER. Certainly my dissertation showed some of these as well. but there are additional benefits, and these include benefits for faculty, right? And some faculty who engaged in OER development and OER adoption, reflected that those opportunities gave them the opportunity to learn from more experienced faculty, right? So in that study, OER development created an environment for increased collegiality. My study certainly found this, but I think there's a great benefit around OER being flexible. And what I mean by that is that there's flexibility about how you use OER. And I'll give you an example. So when I adopted OER, I did a couple of things. There were a couple of textbooks that I liked, and because they were free, I could use whatever I wanted from them. So for a lesson on customer service and sales, I was able to use a chapter from one OER and another chapter from an OER and put those together, and then publish those in a form that my students could consume. And it was very easy to do, and it allowed me to be flexible. It allowed me to be quick, and flexibility also, I think it also is around flexibility of publishing, right? So in traditional, if you've written a book, sort of a traditional textbook, typically that maintenance cycle takes several years, and for OER, it's much quicker to be able to publish updates to an OER textbook than it is to a traditional commercialized textbook. And so I think that's certainly a benefit of OER that isn't quite touted as often as, oh, this saves students money, right? And then I think the other thing is that some faculty who have engaged in OER in this other study by Weller et al., they commented that just the process of adopting a new textbook, whether the fact that it was OER, made them reflect on how they were teaching, right? And made them think about teaching, and so they improved their teaching through that process because they were sort of forced to reflect on their practices. And I'll talk a little bit about how open educational practices as a subset of OER, so OEP, has done some of that as well, has sort of forced educators to sort of think about the approach to instruction and deep and meaningful learning. The other thing that I think is worth noting here, and obviously it's worth noting here because it's sort of central to the topic here, but I think we can't discount the opportunity that OER offers us to pay respect to cultural and gender differences, to open up and give a voice to the voiceless. And that can be done in several ways with OER, right? And we talk a lot about sort of the traditional canon of educational curriculum, the traditional canon of research that is typically used. Well, with OER, you can be very flexible and inclusive in the type of voices that are heard in the development of the resources that you're creating. And so it's a huge opportunity, and certainly something that I was concerned with early on around, is this a missed opportunity? But it sounds like there's a lot of buy-in around this idea of let's think about how our discipline is presenting information and concepts, and then let's take the opportunity of OER development to work with us to reimagine what that dialogue and those narratives look like. And I think this is huge, right? And I really love this quote. Lambert sort of was in this article was saying that it was sort of mirroring what I'm saying, which is that we really need to think about OER and the sort of the definition of OER in more broad terms. And so what Lambert proposed is this definition, which essentially is, you know, all the things that you would think OER is, which is free digital learning experiences. But they've added this idea of OER should also benefit and empower non-privileged learners, right? And those who may be underrepresented in education or marginalized in their global context. And so as Lambert puts it, you know, we have an opportunity here to really define this in this way and in these terms. And so it's up to us as the people who are going to be building and developing these materials to make this a priority, right? And I think, to me, this quote sort of represents the end goal, right? The end goal of making OER a catalyst for inclusion, a catalyst for beyond just access, right? And so I really am encouraged by this type of dialogue, and I'm certainly going to do everything that I can as an educator to advocate for Lambert's definition of OER within my own work as well. So we want to talk a little bit about, so what is OER, right? And at its core, OER is educational, right? It's an educational resource. And so, you know, while we've talked a little bit about textbooks, and textbooks are really a huge component of OER, you know, OER are digital objects. They could be images, they can be videos, they can be interactive content, they could be, you know, online courses, they could be study guides, anything that's really educational in nature can be potentially OER, right? The other part that sort of makes OER is this idea that it's free to students. There is a cost, but the cost shouldn't be to students. And so it's free to students, and typically it's to be OER. You know, typically what you see in definitions, and what I agree with, is not only is it free to students, but it's also stored somewhere where people can have access to it, people beyond just students, right? And so stored in some sort of public domain where other folks can have access to it. And then it's often what sort of differentiates what we talked about, the question earlier around open access. OER is often licensed to be used, modified, and shared with others. So I think that's sort of the difference maker between what is open access, which is access to materials that are open, but for it to be OER, it's also open so that you can take it and then do something with it, right? Make it your own, change it. Open access, typically you can't change it. And then the other aspect that I think is important is that OER is almost always developed and published in a digital format. Now, there are exceptions to this. There are some libraries that I've heard who are printing their OER, and then they're giving them the printed copies to students, and as a way of bridging the digital divide. And so I think that's a great thing. But for the most part, when you think of OER, you're thinking of it from the standpoint of it's in some sort of digital format. So I do want to provide, yes, and I see that someone sort of talked about this a little bit, but I do want to provide a brief history about the origins of OER. And OER was coined in Paris, France, July of 2002 at the UNESCO conference. And there was a group there out of MIT that had developed this open courseware project. And essentially they were creating these courses online, and they were publishing them for anyone to be able to have access to them, right? And so they called it open courseware. And in Paris, France, July of 22 at the UNESCO conference, they sort of asked that that this philosophy, this open philosophy, be coined open educational resources, and so UNESCO adopted that term, and the rest is history with respect to the term open educational resources. But I also don't want to discount sort of the work that was happening on the other side, which is the increased use of what were called back then learning objects. And Merlot was a huge repository in the early 2000s, and they also created what would now be coined open educational resources. Right? There were a huge group of educators. And I think this was sort of a product of the growth of online learning. They created this huge repository of learning objects, and folks could use these learning objects, and they consisted of lessons and documents and different kinds of videos and learning tools, interactive learning tools. Like I remember seeing a lot of like Flash learning tools back when Flash was a big deal in Merlot. And so that was sort of an early pioneer of open educational resources. They weren't called that, they were mostly called learning objects, but they were there. And then you can't discount sort of MOOCs, right? And MOOCs is, I consider MOOCs OER. MOOCs are open, and they're educational resources, and MOOCs were, in 2012 is kind of when they became super popular. And they remained really popular till about 2018 or so, 2015 to 18. They started, but they were hailed for a while there as a potential disruptor in higher education. We learned a lot about sort of the MOOC craze, and people thought, higher education would never be the same after MOOCs. And in some ways, I guess it isn't, but in some ways, MOOCs didn't have the disruptive force that many people touted it would. But it did teach us a lot about what works well in online education, and potentially what doesn't in online education, and the importance around community and things of that nature. And so, but MOOCs were a big deal, and they were a form of OER. And then, of course, it goes without saying that textbooks have been a huge deal, right? Textbooks have sort of been the latest sort of avenue in which OER has gained popularity and legitimacy in higher education specifically. And it's because of what Wiley calls the open spectrum, right? Which is that commercial textbooks tend to be the most expensive to students, and then they tend to be the most restrictive to teachers. And then you have like library resources, which is what we talked about, like ResearchGate and some of the other open access, which tend to be free of cost for students, but they're very restrictive in their permissions and their copyright to students and to teachers. So certainly you have access to them, but you can't really change it or manipulate them in the way that you can with open educational resources. And open educational resources, or OER, you can do that. They're free to students, and then you can implement what are called the 5 R's, and we'll talk a little bit about the 5 R's right now. So what makes OER, and what's key to sort of how OER works is the 5 R's, right? And what this means is that basically for any resource that you develop that you want to be OER, or that is OER, you basically can do these things with it, right? You can reuse a content. So when I first adopted OER, I adopted one textbook first. And so I used it in its unaltered form. And so I did this first one, right, which is to reuse. And then, through my work as an instructional designer, I created some images, and this is actually an example of an image. And I published it using a Creative Commons license, which allows me to retain some rights to it, which means, like, for instance, this image has a CC BY And the by means that you just have to, you can use this, you just have to give an attribution to the original developer of this image, right? And so I've done that here, right? Lumen Learning created this image. And so I've used it, but I've given them attribution. And so you have the right to retain some attribution or some different types of rights, depending on what Creative Commons license you want to use. And they're all different kinds. There's some that you can say you can use this, but for non-commercial use, and or you can use this, but you have to license whatever you make in the same license that I've done. So there's different ways of creating those licenses. And then you have what's called revise, right? So this is where you adapt or adjust or modify. This is so certainly I could have adapted this image. I could have, changed the colors on it. I could have changed the fonts. I could have done other things to it and adapted it and made it my own. And as long as I'm using the attribution, then I would have been fine to do that. Or you could remix. So as I mentioned that initially I created an OER, or I adopted an OER textbook for one of my courses. Well, then I decided I wanted to use the other textbook as well, because those two chapters worked really well from this other textbook. And so I combined them myself. I essentially created a PDF with both chapters in it. And so what I did is I remixed that original content and I combined it with something with a different content, and I created something new. And then of course you get to distribute or republish copies of whatever it is that you've done as part of the OER process, right? The OER revision or redistribution or remix process. So one of the more exciting sort of products that have come out of OER is this idea of OEP, which are open educational practices. So while some of us have been very concerned around the development of OER resources and the development of these resources, some educators have been very focused on, so how do we use these and how do we use the process of OER to create meaningful knowledge, right? And I think OER lends itself really well to open educational practices, and these are particularly, or they're all kinds of practices, but I think the ones that I think are really meaningful are the fact that that open educational practices promote this idea of student-driven learning. And this starts with the idea that students should have some sort of pathway or choice in the learning process, right? And there are different ways you can do this with OEP, as I mentioned, with OER, as I mentioned before. You can provide, you have the freedom because these resources are free. You can provide a lot of them, and you could give students choice, like, do you want to watch this or do you want to read this, right? And so it gives you that sort of freedom to be able to give students some ownership in the learning experience. The other thing I think that's really exciting is this idea of knowledge co-creation. Some educators have created OER by working with students as co-creators. And so a faculty member that I talked to in my study, they were creating a manual for qualitative research. And instead of them writing the manual themselves, they worked with students to do it. These were graduate students, and they essentially just worked together and developed a resource, and students were part of that resource process. And so by the end of their graduate career, they had a publication, which was something that was important in their discipline. And so that's another way that that I think open educational practices are valuable. And I think ultimately, you can't change the traditional canon. You can't break down power and privilege in your discipline. You can't have reflective practices around what voices are being silenced without sort of building the scholarly community. And I think OEP, what OEP does really well is sort of forces educators and students to have an active dialogue around social justice and around the curriculum as it stands, right? And to have real conversations around what is it that we're wanting to share, what are the concepts that are important, what are the voices that are being silenced, and how can we bring those voices to the forefront. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our project, but essentially one of the things that we're trying to do is we're in our pilot project is we're asking the question, where does the student voice fit within the concepts that we're trying to cover, and how can we incorporate the student voice in that process? So this all sounds great, right? But how do you take the theory of sort of OER of creating equity and inclusion, and how do you apply that to practice? Well, that's something that we're sort of aiming to do with our digital OER program. And I'll just explain very quickly, because I know we're sort of coming to the end here, and I want to give some time for questions. We're creating this program that's going to fit within what we're doing with our peer developed courses. So right now we provide stipends faculty. We fund the development of peer developed courses, and essentially those are courses that are developed by a peer group of faculty, and then they serve as sort of the master course for that subject for TCC Connect. And what we wanted to do is to provide an opportunity for faculty not to just develop the peer developed course, but also develop the OER that accompanies that peer developed course, so that faculty, when they're going into the peer developed course process, they have a primary source and that they can use that's not tied to some commercial interest, right? And so I think that was sort of the idea, the initial idea behind the TCC Connect digital OER program. And what we're building specifically is OER textbooks, right? And we're awarding 3 categories of stipends to our faculty. And we're awarding stipends for OER enhancements to existing textbooks, OER textbooks, revision and redesign, which is a little bit more of a stipend, and then an even bigger stipend for new development. And so these are for basically projects or faculty or groups of faculty who want to engage in developing an OER textbook from scratch. And the way we're proposing to interject and to promote and to advocate for inclusion in the development of really to sort of realize Lambert's vision for what OER could be, is that we're being very intentional in how we proposed our purpose statement, right? We're being very upfront with that we're designing this to improve and increase equity. We're designing this to improve educational outcomes for traditionally underserved students, first generation students of color, and low socioeconomic and disadvantaged students, right? So the students that traditionally don't have a voice. We're intentional about saying we are going to hopefully design this project in a way that that promotes success outcomes for these students. And some of the ways that we're doing this, and so we are in a pilot phase, and so some of the ways that we're proposing that we do this is that we're proposing that priority be given to projects that, based on things such as student impact or inclusive design of the OER. And so while we're certainly looking at other aspects, some of the questions we ask or some of the questions that we're going to ask as we develop more of these projects are, what impact does that have on students, that project? And how is that project inclusive? What about that project makes it inclusive? And then we're setting that as criteria, as part of the criteria for how we select what projects get created and which ones don't, or which ones potentially get created after some modification or manipulation. The other thing that we're proposing as part of this process is, typically in the development of a textbook, you have a peer review process. And so we're designing into our OER textbook a two-step peer review process. And in that peer review process, we're including criteria such as accessibility of the OER. So we are going to be, as part of the peer review process, also reviewing OER for accessibility, for the, particularly for the principles of universal design for learning. And then we're also going to be encouraging the idea of including research, work, contributions, and perspectives from scholars who have been traditionally marginalized. And so, and what I mean by scholars, that could be research from academia, but that could also mean scholars as students, right? The student voice that I talked about earlier. So this is the way that we're aiming to promote the inclusion part of the equity and inclusion in the work that we're doing at Tarrant County College in our OER development program. Okay, I see that there's a hand up. Okay.
Yeah, but probably it doesn't happen in Samsung. Do you want to make a question? Or it was?
Yeah, maybe if they can type it into the chat. If not, maybe we can wait
Please
till the very end. We're almost done.
Yeah, we use the chat, please.
Okay.
Probably was that person doesn't know. Okay.
Okay. So I just want to give a brief sort of overview of where we are in this project. We are currently in phase 1 or beginning phase 1, in that we're working to create a pilot. We actually selected the project that we'll be doing, which is we are going to be revising a Texas government course, a Texas government textbook. And we are going to be including those aspects that we talked about. And so in this phase 1 of our program at TC Connect, we hope to develop an infrastructure to be able to manage not just OER development at the institution level, but also OER adoption, because we feel like by creating OER development, we're going to have more, we're going to get more opportunities or have faculty that are interested in adoption, and we need to be able to support that as well. So we're going to be promoting OER adoption with partnerships with great repositories like OpenStax. What I like about OpenStax is that they too have sort of committed to being more inclusive in the development of their open educational resources. And so they certainly fit the mold that we're trying to create when it comes to partnerships around OER development. And then we're also looking into technology infrastructure. Where are we storing our OER? What is it going to look like? That kind of stuff. What technologies do we need to make this happen? So that's all going to be part of phase 1, which essentially kicks off this semester in October, really. And then beyond that, phase 2, we'll continue to look at what we're doing. We'll continue to ask questions around staffing and expertise. Do we need additional expertise to continue this work? Do we need additional strategic partnerships? There are a lot of institutions who are interested in developing OER, but maybe they can't fund it alone, but certainly they could fund half of it. And so certainly we'll be looking at those kinds of partnerships where there are 2 institutions that maybe share resources, things of that nature. And then we'll explore, as we move forward into phase 3, we need to have a plan for OER maintenance. It's not enough to build OER at an institution level. You also got to maintain it so that it remains current and with the latest research and that kind of stuff. And then we're going to explore other things, or at least these are things that I hope we can do. I hope we can explore 0 cost degrees. So these are like 0 textbook cost degrees, and then explore some of those student-driven projects that I talked about earlier. Are there opportunities for our students to develop OER? And if so, how can we make that happen at our institution? And so these are some of the things that we're trying to do as an institution to sort of promote this work moving forward, or that we hope to do in order to promote this work moving forward. So I've reached the point where I'd be happy to take any questions about my work at TC or OER in general.
Let me open my microphone. So this is the time to make questions. Either you can raise your hand. Let me put the gallery. Do you want to stop sharing so we can see
Yes.
everyone? If you don't
Absolutely,
mind.
I can stop sharing. I do want to.
Yeah.
Well, before I stop
Okay.
sharing, I do want to give.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I do want to just, if you do have questions and you want
Great.
a way to reach me, my Twitter handle is AGOsuna, and then I'm also available by email at arturo.osuna@tccd.edu. And so
Excellent.
if you do want to reach me, those are definitely ways that you can reach me. And so I'll go and stop the share, and then we'll see if folks have questions.
Excellent. I will open the chat to see if we have some questions. We have one, but you already replied this one. Any other questions? This is the time you can either use the chat or raise your hand, and you can open, Bella, in order your microphone, your audio, mute your audio so you can do the question yourself. In the meantime, that the people are, Bella, preparing their question, it could be in Spanish and we can translate as well too, because we have a lot of faculty from Puerto Rico. Let me tell you that the webinar that we have, the last in September 8th, the certificate haven't been delivered yet or sent to everyone yet. So please give us until tomorrow to send this certificates, and this one will be either next week or the week after. So please allow us always 2 weeks to receive your certificates, because we are working very hard in doing a lot of different events, and this is our priority to continue offering you events. But if you request it, you will receive it for sure. Okay, if passed more than a month and you haven't received it, then send us an email, because probably it's a question. Okay. People say we will be able to receive a link to this meeting since it was recorded. The recording, all the recordings of our webinars are in the same page that you came with. Click on the website in webinars in English. You will see below the registration form, you will see the past of all the recordings. So in the same page you register, you will see all the recordings. And also, if you follow us on social media, we always post it when the recording is ready. So you can go to the link and see the recording. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Mira, I just see Arturo. I don't know if you're seeing the chat. Everybody giving thank you, asking for the recording. No questions. Sydney said for her. Thank you for the link. No question, but comment. Thank you for an informative and well-done presentation. I truly enjoy it, Sydney said. Also, Arturo is saying thanks to Alfredo, that put a lot of comments. Thank you, Alfredo, by the way. También Valeria said, le agradezco mucho. Thank you. And what else? Okay, I don't see if it was very clear.
There is one question. I'm answering it now. So yeah, so yes. Someone asked, actually, I'll just answer it. I forget I can talk here.
Yes.
So how successful has the TC Connect program been? So we are just starting a pilot. So we haven't created an OER ourselves yet. We are in the process of creating one, and we'll be starting our process October 1st. And as I mentioned, we will be revising an existing OER for Texas government. But we did run some data, and it did show that we have a lot of adoptions at TCC Connect. I think we're up in like the 30 to 40% range of our faculty who are using OER as a primary or secondary resource in their course. So adoption has been a big, a popular option for our faculty. And so that sort of gave us also incentive to try to create a program for development at our campus.
Also, Arturo, Lilian Colom asked if I would like to know if OER is being used in Native American reservations.
That is a great question. I want to say that I read an article about OER being used as a vehicle to sort of to engage in indigenous cultures, and I know that there is some work being done by, oh, I'm gonna forget, but there is some work being done at some of the reservations around OER, but I can't recall off the top of my head who's doing the work and what does it entail. But I know that this certainly fits, you know, paying, acknowledging and paying respect to the work of the indigenous communities, as and I know that some of the faculty members that I talked to who were developing OER were talking about including indigenous voices in their work as part of their OER development. So I think that's certainly an important endeavor as we move forward, thinking about indigenous voices, you know, talk about marginalized voices. So that's certainly an important step moving this forward.
Okay, excellent. Pues thank you. We are here is 4 minutes after 4. So remember, I just put the link again to remember to click in that link in order to go to the form and put your name, your email, make sure it's correct, because if not, when we try to send the certificate, it's gonna bounce and it will not get to you. So make sure the email is correct. And also we put the link to the next events page that we have in our new redesigned website, so you can see all the different events that we will be offering this semester. Arturo, thank you so much. If we don't have any more questions, let me see if we have any other question. No, just thank you. Very good presentation. You will have access, Arturo, if you can send us the presentation in a PDF format, we will appreciate it, because usually we put it besides the link of the recording, we also put it on the same page that we have the repository of all the webinars recordings. Okay, so thank you. We hope to see you in the next event. Remember, next event is going to be in Puerto Rico at the Inter-American University Theater here in Coupé, where our office is located. It's going to be the Student Leadership Showcase. Everyone is welcome to come. And if you cannot join us face-to-face, please, when you register, say that you want to connect virtually, and then you will receive the link to connect. And hope to join us in the rest of the webinars we are putting together for you during this semester. Thank you so much, Arturo, again for your time. Let me see if we have any other notes. Everything in the chat are great comments. Remember, you will be receiving by email the link to a survey, electronic survey. Please help us evaluate our events and also our services. Hope to see you next time. Have a good day and enjoy the rest of the week and the weekend. Thank you, Arturo. Take care. Thank you, everyone. We're gonna stop the recording right now.
Thank you, Arturo.